an original MCM production.
We have a wonderful program that we're doing in conjunction with the Press Club. And so with that, I want to call upon my friend Mark Cass, who's going to introduce and help moderate the program.
Thank you, Joanne. That was great. You have a great new name now. They call you President. That's awesome. I'm going to try that around the office. I don't think it's going to work, but I'll try it. I'm honored to be here today as a member of the Press Club and also a co-worker of our speaker. This is a great event for the Press Club to be involved with because it speaks a lot in terms of the quality of journalism that's really necessary in the world right now. So what we're doing today is really kind of doing an in-depth look at a series of stories that ran in our paper earlier in October. An in-depth look at Amazon and its impact on really throughout the United States. And I think it's more relevant here because of what's going on with Foxconn. And it's a real interesting topic. So I want to introduce our speaker, John Wile. He spearheaded the project for us. He oversees, this is going to be hard to say, but 40 editors across the country, which is kind of like herding cats. But he oversees all of us and really worked with all of the newsrooms throughout the country. So that's probably upwards of, probably 125 reporters or more, 400 journalists throughout the country to actually work on this story in cities from Austin to LA to Florida to, really throughout the country. So really a lot of work. He holds our top editorial spot at ACBJ, and he's been with us now for 5 years. He spent his first few years with us as, I used to call him our head artist. He was our designer and really helped overhaul all of our newspapers throughout the country, and he really did a great job. He spent the last 18 months or so as the head of editorial. He is a native of Akron, Ohio, and yes, it's true, he is a fan of the Browns. We won't hold that against him since right now we're kind of struggling here in our state with our football team, but we still have won a lot more games, John. Not hard to boast, that's right. He's a 20-year veteran of the newspaper business and has worked in the past at the Akron Beacon Journal, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the Washington Post. I'm happy to present John Wile.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me. Joanne, thank you for the invite. It's an honor for me to be here. Thanks to Mark and Kira for helping make this possible. We are going to talk about Amazon here in a little bit, but I want to talk about the larger media industry as a whole because I think it's a really interesting and rather dangerous and precarious time we are living in. As Joan talked about earlier, of how media is changing so quickly. When I was in school, which I'm starting to feel that age where I can start to say that and shake my fist a little bit, I remember being in an honors ethics class in journalism, and one of the things that was good and bad that happened during that time was 9/11 happened while I was taking that class, and the teacher came in and it was our second week of the year, and she told us to take the textbook and just throw it away. We weren't going to use it anymore. And so we had just great, stunning conversation about how you cover such a horrific event as 9/11. And we were taught a lot of things in that class, and it's the one class I have the most memories from and carry forth a lot of what I learned there in my profession now. And one of the things she taught, and I see you guys have it over here, is this idea around bias, and we can't be biased as reporters, as editors. But unfortunately, I'm going to tell you I do have a few biases, and we're going to talk about some of those today. And those biases are pretty clear in my mind. A bias towards real news, a bias towards transparency, and a bias towards accountability. And I feel like as we enter this dangerous time in media, you have seen it happen, unfortunately, here with the Journal Sentinel and with other publications across the country. There are fewer and fewer reporters, fewer editors, and fewer journalists covering the news that we need to have at a local level. I think the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing a great job covering national politics and national issues, but ultimately stories like the Amazon effect and Foxconn carry way more weight here in Milwaukee and in cities just like this across the country. So, real news. How many people in here pay for news? Oh, you all are all my friends. Thank you. I don't care where you get your news. I'm not here to tout the Business Journal or slam our competitors, but I do believe you have to pay for real news. We unfortunately are not a nonprofit the last time I checked, so we do have to pay people like Mark a salary. And it's becoming tougher and tougher to make money in the media industry. And I think that is one of our challenges as big tech has taken over the Facebooks and the Googles, and they're able to undercut us on advertising and make everyone a publisher. Everybody all of a sudden thinks they can be a reporter. And I'm sure, how many of you have been interviewed by a reporter how many of you have had a tough experience with a reporter? Yeah. It's hard being a reporter. It's hard being an editor. I know a lot of you think there's no skill involved. I promise you there is. But the more we keep cutting to the bottom in the media industry, the harder it's going to get to have good reporters, and reporters that have done this for 20 and 30 years, that understand how government works, how business works, even the inner workings of a sports team. We rely a lot on information, and it's becoming scarcer and scarcer to find. Does anybody here get all their news from Facebook? Anybody? Okay, again, you people are my friends. I like you all. I think that's one of the challenges we have with millennials and our younger audiences, is that they believe they read something on the internet, therefore it must be true. And I guarantee you that is not the case. So, continue to keep asking, demanding your younger generations that you're around to pay for news. I read a story the other day that only 16% of Americans are paying for news right now, which is pretty astonishing. That means over 80% are expecting it for free. And that's a real problem. That's going to continue to be a problem. Again, I'm going to point to the Amazon story. This took hundreds of hours of effort across 40 different newsrooms to pull together, and it took a lot of skill. Doing open records requests and trying to dig out information, even in a day and age when we have so much readily available, there is still skill and nuance in deciphering that, in delivering an open records request, in getting back a document that's 250 pages and being able to go through it and mine out what you need. These are all skills, and these are skills that people on Facebook and people that have blogs, frankly, aren't willing to put in the time. They want to give you their opinion and tell you why things matter, rather than giving you facts and helping you decide for yourself whether something matters or not. So, let's talk a little bit about transparency. I think that's the thing, that's probably the most relevant to our conversation, something Mark and I will talk about here in a little bit. But companies like Foxconn and Amazon, transparency is an interesting issue with them. Amazon was at first really ready to play ball and wanted to be very interested in the project when we approached them and told them what we were doing, and then they quickly shut it down, and then they quickly went into defense mode against us. I think it's very ironic that a lot of the times when Amazon or Foxconn comes into a place, they come in very quickly, very secretively. A lot of times these meetings happen behind closed doors, and then at the end of the day, they want taxpayer money. And we're very quick to hand out taxpayer money with promises of jobs and economic development. I think the challenge for us as journalists is how do we make people aware of what's going on, and then how do we hold these companies accountable? Amazon's a prime example of giving out millions of dollars in incentives, but we never voted on any of that. Today in Charlotte, in my hometown, there's a $900 million bond issue to improve schools. We're going to vote on that. We never voted on whether or not we should give Amazon incentives. And ultimately, Amazon needed to come to all of our cities because they need to be around people. That's how their business works. So it's been interesting to me that economic development officials, mayors, even here, the governor touted Amazon's coming here and creating jobs, and that's a great thing. We do need jobs, but they need to be the right jobs, and we need to hold them accountable for what those jobs are. So, again, in closing, if you're going to do anything and you don't listen to anything else today, please pay for media. It's again, I don't care if it's us, if it's the Journal Sentinel, but media companies, we need to exist to help people understand what's going on. The last example I'll give is in the state of North Carolina, our political system's a little bit crazy right now, as I'm sure many of you have heard. We have one person covering the State House because the same corporation owns all the papers there, and so they are consolidating and trying to save, and so Greensboro, Raleigh, and Charlotte all used to have their own State House reporter, and now there is only one State House reporter. And so that causes some challenges, and this is all because of cutbacks. And unfortunately, we're trying to cut our way to the bottom as media companies. And as all of you who have run or owned or been a major part of a business, you're never going to cut your way to growing yourself. So, thank you.
All right, now it's time for some fun, some questions.
This is going to be the hard part.
That's right. I get to ask you all the personal questions. I'll get to those later. Let's start with, how did the story start? Kind of where did the idea come from? How did it evolve in terms of what it ended up being?
Okay. So the front page you're seeing here ran in all 40 of our different business journals across the country. We had 4 different covers available, so it didn't feel like the same. But the idea really generated from our local editors. So we have an internal news competition every year at our company. We ask editors like Mark to submit their best work, and we take a look at that, and then we vote on it. And so in last year's submissions, we really noticed a lot of Project Toto, Project Iron, all these secret projects that were coming to a city where economic development officials were talking, they were getting excited about something, but they wouldn't tell us what it was. And so we would do public records requests, really kind of work our sources. And in the end, multiple stories came out that it was Amazon building a fulfillment center or a distribution center. And so we started realizing there might be something larger there. I think Amazon's a unique company, kind of a once-in-a-generation company that sprawls across the U.S., that they have to have a footprint in so many places for their business model to work. And the beauty for our company is we're a local business. If I give Mark a piece of content and tell him to run it on his website, you guys may or may not care because it doesn't have to do with the Milwaukee business community. And that's what we strive on in all of our cities, is that we're focused on local business. And so the thing I was really proud of with this was these were local stories that you all produced that then we rolled up nationally into this big project.
So, I know there was a big number found. How much was the overall incentives offered, and kind of how do they vary across the country?
So the incentives that we have found, we're still digging, but we're at $1.24 billion for 260 facilities across the country. When we told Amazon what we had found and asked them for comment, they actually had no issue with the $1.24 billion, which was surprising. They did have an issue with us publishing all 260 locations. That was something that nobody's really done that before, so they were a little on edge about that, I guess I would say. And the incentives varied, and this was just hard incentives. This doesn't include abatements or other things. In Baltimore, for instance, they were given a break. They didn't have to pay sales tax on any of their building materials. There was no way for us to quantify that, so we didn't even include that in the number. There are long kind of 5-year tax plan or tax cuts that were really tough for us to quantify. We didn't include those. So my guess is, all said and done, you're talking, it's probably around $2 billion. And this is a company that has $26 billion in cash, and we are funding them. We are letting them come in. We are giving them money, usually in exchange for jobs. But these aren't great jobs. These are jobs at fulfillment centers, distribution centers. They're mostly warehouse jobs that we said are going to go away. I mean, Amazon is one of the leading robotics companies out there right now. They're going to figure out ways to automate these warehouse jobs. You're already seeing it happen in places like Milwaukee. It's happening in Columbus, Ohio right now. And again, I think that's the accountability. Are we going to hold them up against, you promised us these 1,500 jobs, which I think it was 1,250 here, and they've delivered 4,000? Yeah, so you guys are a great example of how it's really worked well, I think.
So now, I mean, that's obviously leads to a question. I assume it's not the same all over the country. Here in our area, it's obviously worked well, and so far at least, they've met our expectations and actually exceeded them. Maybe some examples of where it has happened and where it hasn't.
So I think you guys are definitely a great example. I remember the governor sent out a press release. Yeah, he was pretty happy with being able to say, hey, we've created over 4,000 jobs. I think where it's been maybe more of a challenge or more of a head scratcher in Cincinnati, they gave $30 million to come use the airport and build more of a distribution hub there. Great, because Delta pulled out and the airport is underutilized right now, and it's a big, beautiful airport. The biggest problem with that is, anybody know who Cincinnati's largest public employers are? Talking Macy's, Procter & Gamble, Kroger, the grocer. I mean, these are all people Amazon is trying to directly compete with and frankly put out of business. And Macy's is having a lot of struggles right now. So I think we have to be very careful when we're handing out these incentives as local communities, because it has a ripple effect. And my wife was trying to buy a pair of pants the other day, and she found them for $98 at a local store, and then went home on Amazon and found them for $82. And it became the debate of, why should I go to the local store when I can get them here for cheaper? But ultimately, that's going to put that local store out of business.
We've talked a bit about openness and kind of transparency. We ran into that here. We had to file a number of open records requests on ours. I assume it's that way, across the country. How much of that was needed, and kind of what was the response out of individuals in terms of the government?
So we did have to file quite a few, dozens of open record requests. When they dealt with a public, a government-based economic development council, makes life a lot easier. If a city or community has a private council, which you can have, those open records requests don't do us anything, obviously. Amazon caught wind of some of this stuff, and they very, very much wanted to know what we were up to. But this is the type of reporting. You don't learn how to do this in J school. You don't. 22 and 23-year-olds that are coming out of school don't know how to do this type of reporting, and that's what really scares me about the future of our industry. Is this is the type of reporting that needs to happen for us to understand how the world is working. And I do believe there is a place for behind closed doors where reporters and journalists, aren't welcome quite yet. That needs to happen, but ultimately, it's our job to help people understand how these hard-earned tax dollars are being put to work. So kind of varied all over the place. Different states have different laws, so that was also a challenge. I think Wisconsin's pretty friendly, relatively speaking. Yeah, but in these open records requests, they can give you so much that it's impossible. Like I said, a 250-page document where you're looking for one or two numbers or one or two little things.
And is that a trend? It seems to be we're seeing more and more of an effort, and we have to file more and more open records requests, and we're doing it on Foxconn. I mean, we filed, 8, 9, or more already on this one. It seems like it's more and more kind of needed. Is that being seen across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, journalists journalists aren't seen in a high regard. I'm not going to pretend that we're the most popular people in the room.
I think that hurts, but I'm not sure.
I'll explain it to you later. So it's tough. How many times have you been called by a journalist when you didn't want to tell the story? It happens.
See, no one's raising their hand. I was going to kind of watch. I was going to write. There we go. All right, right. Jeff Fleming. Yeah, there's a shock. How many open records requests have I filed with you, Jeff? That should be the question. Right?
But that's also part of being a public official. I think it goes both ways. So it's a challenge. I think ultimately. I turn back to your guys' sayings here. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? And I think that's one of our challenges as journalists. If anybody thinks we're in this to get rich, I guarantee you we're not. We do this because we're passionate about it, and we're passionate about telling stories and passionate about shining a light where it shouldn't be, or maybe it hasn't been. So I think that's the open records requests. I worry it's going to become a lost art form as daily newspapers and others get really fascinated by how many clicks they can get and what we can do online. I think this type of boots on the ground, shoe leather, old school reporting is needed now more than ever.
You spoke earlier kind of a little bit about the Amazon response. Kind of maybe explain that as to kind of how they responded early, how they responded after it came out, and even now as we work on HQ2.
Yeah, so their rebuttal to us was just under probably 2,500 words would be my guess in an email to us.
By who?
Written by one of their higher-ups. We originally asked to talk to one of their vice presidents. They actually offered us an SVP, someone that reports right to Jeff Bezos, and then they pulled that back as they, I believe, started understanding more the scope of the project. So they kind of went dark on us, and then 48 hours before we published, they came out. They helped verify the 260 locations. They didn't want to touch the incentives. They never argued the incentives, which I think is interesting. What they've had some issues with, we talked about how these are warehouse jobs and these aren't the best jobs, and they of course came back and said, well, we offer great benefits, which I'm sure they do, but ultimately a lot of companies offer great benefits. They had huge issues with us touting them as a robotics company that's looking to automate jobs. But Jeff's one of the biggest sponsors of robotics competitions and other things. So, and then the thing they really had the biggest debate with was us publishing this interactive map that has all the locations of where they're at, where their boots on the ground are, a really granular look. And we're also selling that data, and I think this is something media companies have gotten smart with, is that data has a real value. And we put a pretty high price tag on it, and we've gotten a handful of people that have given us that high price tag, to which to me is, we're doing some lead gen for people.
So now it's on to HQ2. So it's just kind of restarting, and this kind of worked out well from a timing standpoint. I'm sure that was all your kind of planning with
I wish we could say this was perfectly timed.
Perfectly timed to occur with that. There is, hundreds of cities across the country who are thrown in sites, including here in Milwaukee. How do you think what we have found in our thing will actually play with what's going on with HQ2?
So this is where the transparency thing is really interesting. HQ2, so a lot of these distribution and fulfillment centers we talked about, they've done very secretively. HQ2 is this public Lollapalooza.
And I should probably ask you maybe to explain what HQ2 is. Like, we can't assume.
Yeah, so Amazon is looking to add a second headquarters. They're looking for 50,000 jobs, a couple hundred acres of space. The RFP is looking for an educated workforce that's highly educated, has a good tech scene, close to higher ed, strong transportation system, international airport, and within 30 minutes of the urban core. Obviously, arts and culture, and I'm sure things like that come into play. So they are looking to, and it's going to be 50,000 jobs, and they haven't put a wage requirement or what these jobs will pay, but it appears they're going to be higher level jobs. These are not going to be warehouse jobs. So, you're talking software engineers, project managers, more the higher end. So with that in mind, I think it's been really interesting that they've been so public about HQ2 and trying to get all these cities to bid. And we have, cities, I think Milwaukee, you guys put 3 or 4 bids in, is that correct? And they really, I think, are trying to see who's going to offer us the most incentives, who's going to ante up the most money for us to come there. So all the bids were due 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. And since then, they have told all the bidders, do not release what you bid. I believe Sean Ryan is here somewhere, one of our outstanding reporters. He broke a story yesterday of where a couple of the bid sites are here in Milwaukee, but also cited that people, have been asked by Amazon to sign confidentiality agreements. So again, this is really interesting to me that they're really public on one side and then super private on the other.
How do you think it's going to play out? Is it going to go to the highest bidder?
Well, I think their timing, as ours was pretty good because Foxconn just got, what, a little over $3 billion?
Actually, 3.8.
Yeah, for
If you count
13
the local.
for 13,000 jobs at 55,000 a head. Yeah. So if that's the going rate for that, Amazon's talking about 3 times, 4 times as many jobs possibly. Do the math. I know New Jersey and Chris Christie put up this monstrous bid that if you total everything up, it could get around $10 billion, I believe it was. So I think people are going to be really aggressive. What nobody's talking about that I think is really interesting, I think Jeff Bezos is one of the smartest guys, of this generation. They have 40,000 people at their headquarters now in Seattle. You're telling me he's going to add 50,000 jobs at a second headquarters? Or is he going to be moving those jobs from Seattle to somewhere else? And I think that's the interesting thing. Seattle also was very aggressive in their bidding, which tells me they're worried. So I think, ultimately I think they're trying to get to the East Coast. It's standard practice to be a big tech company on the West Coast, but Amazon's not a tech company anymore. They're a logistics company, a manufacturing company, a distributor. There's so much more. So I think ultimately they're going to come east, and I'd be surprised. Just like Boeing left Seattle 5 years ago to go to Chicago, they still have a major operation out there, but that HQ is no longer in Seattle.
You think Milwaukee's in the mix? Got to ask that because it'd be. I know it's speculation, obviously, but with what went on with Foxconn, what we hear from individuals is that has helped us on the radar. We're now on the radar nationally. Is there a chance?
Certainly, there's a chance. I think you got to fit a lot of the criteria here. I think the 2 biggest things probably are is the tech scene robust enough and by that I mean the tech workforce. Do you have the pipeline of software engineers and other people, and is the higher ed strong enough here? I think those are going to be the challenges. You certainly have land. You certainly have affordability. I think the airport with some modifications is probably big enough. Public transit's important, so I think that also could be possibly limiting. But they also saw, they're not fools out at Amazon. They they saw that the state of Wisconsin, ponied up $3.8 billion to land Foxconn. So if there's still money left, I think that'll be the big thing.
The thing I'm often asked now, anywhere I go about this issue, is what's happening with Foxconn and Amazon now become the norm? Will there be anybody who moves of any significant size who does not ask for incentives?
Well, sure, right? I mean, if I'm going to bring 10,000 jobs, I want something for it.
I'm
And
talking about 100 jobs. I'm talking about 25 jobs. I'm talking 30 jobs.
certainly,
Why wouldn't you ask?
well, the worst thing you can hear is no, right? So I do think it will become more the norm. I think these negotiations probably happen more than everybody knows about, and I think they'll continue to happen. And I think the magnitude and scale has certainly brought a lot out with Foxconn and Amazon. But like you said, 100 jobs. We talked to somebody in Michigan who had an economic development official had this great quote. He said, "You have to understand, up here, some jobs are better than no jobs." And I think, I grew up in the Midwest. Midwestern towns like Cleveland have been hit hard by the recession, and to be able to create 100 jobs or 1,500 jobs or 10,000 jobs, that matters to a community. And certainly it matters to public officials that are trying to show growth.
I mean, do you think that just because of what's happened with Foxconn and now with Amazon, something about that, there's going to be more questions? Or is this going to become a rubber stamp?
So I think that's really interesting. I think, it all comes down to when these deals are on the table, are we going to get to see them before they get approved? Are we going to get to see the contract? Are we going to be able to understand what is being offered and what is coming back? And then who's holding them accountable? If they don't deliver all those jobs, what are we going to do? 5 years down the line, who's checking back to see that Foxconn delivered 13,000 jobs? And if they didn't, what's going to happen to those benefits? And I think there needs to be some sort of an accountability task force, and I'm sure economic development councils, development officials, and politicians have these worked in, but are we actually going to punish these companies if they don't follow through on the promises?
You obviously, being where you are down on the East Coast, kind of watch what's happened here over the past few months with Foxconn. Kind of what was the reaction elsewhere across the country of what went on here and of the amount of money that was offered?
It was the holy
cow.
Yes, holy cow type of moment. Thank you. To see that, over $3 billion, I think that's, one of the staggering things, and Foxconn outside of here, I don't think a lot of people, who's that? That was the other thing, but 13,000 jobs, that's, I challenge you guys, do you have 13,000 qualified workers to put in there? That's going to be one of the challenges for Milwaukee. Is your workforce able to populate all that, or maybe you're going to bring in outside talent, which is always good to grow your city. But I think it was an eye raiser, and I certainly think Jeff Bezos and Amazon, they're not foolish. They saw what happened back in late May and early June and said, okay, what can we get?
What was the biggest, kind of as you look back over the past few months with the story, what was the biggest surprise?
Well, that's a great question. He told me he would throw me a curveball, and I just got it.
I'm going to ask you a Browns question. But
the Browns, there's nothing to talk about with the Browns. I think personally just seeing our newsrooms do this type of reporting was really good. You certainly do a lot of it here in Milwaukee, but I'd be lying if I said all 40 of our newsrooms were as strong as what we have in Milwaukee. And so I think doing this type of reporting and reminding people both internally and externally that we're more than just a website or a newspaper, that we tackle big, tough issues. I think that was something I was really proud of. And again, it's challenging. You talked about herding cats. I think we had never done anything like this and rolled up all 40 newsrooms. Everybody knows the Milwaukee Business Journal as this great local entity, but I think very few know it as part of a national corporation. That has strong ties all across the company or the country. And so I think for our company to do that was a special moment. And I don't know that we'll do another thing like this. We're not going to just do one a year because we want to do this. I think Amazon was a unique story that touched all 40 of our cities.
I'm going to open it up to audience questions. If not, I always have more, but I'm sure there are plenty of questions in the audience. Turn around. Go ahead. It was here. How do you compare, obviously, the owner of Amazon owning Amazon, but also owning a very large newspaper?
Yeah, so I worked at the Washington Post, actually, before I came to the business journals, and left right before Jeff bought the paper. So, Jeff's done wonderful things for that paper, and he's really given them a long runway. They're finally profitable again. They're doing wonderful journalism, and that journalism stretches far beyond what we see in the national headlines. But I think it's really interesting that a guy that owns a paper that's slogan is "Democracy dies in darkness." They're not the most transparent company in the world. I also think everything Jeff Bezos does is a calculated move. If you don't believe he is one of the smartest men, businessmen out there right now, you look at how much lobbying dollars they've put in the last 5 years, which was a story we ran on the Business Journal site. They are now one of the top 20 spenders on K Street. And so I think certainly he wanted to acquire the Washington Post, who won. It's one of the most famous papers in our country's history. But I think there was some strategy involved of having a footprint in Washington. He just bought a $23 million house there, the largest house in D.C. So I think there was a lot of strategy around how he was going to use that base in D.C. to leverage. from what I can tell and what I see and my friends that are still there, I think he's done a wonderful job of keeping the Post and Amazon as separate entities. But I think there was a lot of strategy of why he wanted to be in D.C.
Others? Questions? Go ahead. Teresa. So the question is, when the RFP was issued for Amazon headquarters too, it was a call for North America. And is there an opportunity or an option that it'll actually end up outside of the United States?
Yeah, I think a lot of media companies, have reported that it's going to be Boston or Atlanta or D.C. and have taken a very American view of it. But I do believe Toronto's a strong contender. Obviously well-educated, good higher ed there, great tech scene, obviously an international city. I think the challenge with any of their biggest cities, so New York, Boston, D.C., Toronto, even maybe a city like Atlanta, are they going to be able to get the land that they want? That they need a lot of land and they want to be near an urban core. So I think that's going to be the challenge for those bigger cities is they check every other box perfectly. And so will that be part of the incentive that is given? Will land get annexed to them or be a tremendous discount basically on that to lure them? Because if you're talking 50,000 jobs, Foxconn already has 1,200 acres, I think, is what Sean told me. So I don't think they're going to need that type of acreage, but they're going to need a couple hundred acres, and yeah. So.
Go ahead. The question is there enough? Basically, are there enough employees in the United States currently to handle Amazon and Foxconn?
Yeah, I think that's to be seen. My brother-in-law is a software engineer, and he keeps wanting to leave his company and start his own thing, and his company keeps giving him more and more money. So I think that's one of the challenges is how do we educate that workforce and get them into position to be able to fill all these jobs. And I think that's where the urban areas have the huge advantage because we're seeing a flock to the coasts right now in our country. As somebody that grew up in the Midwest and loves the Midwest, I'm a prime example. I moved to a coastal city or a near coastal city. So I think that's why the East Coast has a tremendous advantage right now because they do have more talent. But with that comes higher wages, higher cost of living. So it'll be very interesting to see as we shift technology-wise to these, what we used to have as traditional manufacturing jobs are becoming more technology and software-based jobs. Will we be able to, as Americans, fill those jobs with our own graduates? And I hope the answer is yes, but I think that is one of the great questions in the next 10 years. And the Business Journal here has done a tremendous job with the gap in the workforce, and I think Milwaukee's not the only city battling that. So it's great to land these companies, but how are we going to be able to pump all of the jobs in? And if I had that answer, I probably wouldn't be a VP of content. I'd probably be making a lot more money doing something else.
Good. Other questions? Oh, go ahead. Sorry. In front of me. Basically, Walmart and Amazon, but Amazon is viewed in a very, very nice light, and then Walmart is viewed very negatively. Kind of why is that? Kind of how hype kind of drives a lot of the things in the country.
So this is a brilliant question. Thank you, because I believe in this 100%. Walmart, what Amazon is doing is not different than what Walmart's been trying to do for 20 years. But because Walmart is viewed as a distribution center essentially, and as you said, pointed towards lower middle class, whereas Amazon's these are tech jobs. It's a tech company. So I think Amazon's cachet certainly helps them with this. And what public official doesn't want to come and say, I brought 1,500 Amazon jobs to City X? They're not saying I brought 1,500 distribution jobs. They're saying I brought 1,500 Amazon jobs. And I think Jeff, again, very smart. He's capitalizing on their cachet. So I agree with you 100%. When Walmart tried to do this in the 90s and the early parts of the 2000s, there was backlash and disdain. But how is that very different from what Amazon is doing right now?
What do you think in terms of offering advice to individuals here in the room as we move forward on Foxconn, as things happen with Amazon and as other companies? What kind of lessons were learned throughout this series that maybe all of us should really watch for?
I think I go back to transparency. I go back to accountability. Really making sure if we're going to give this much, again, it could be $25 million for a company that's going to bring 1,500 jobs. But if we're going to spend $25 million, that's $25 million that aren't going into our schools, aren't going into our roads, aren't going into the things that taxpayers expect. So, and we're all in this room, I believe we're all probably paying taxes. So at least I hope we are. So I think it's that accountability piece. And, we as journalists need to do a better job of following up on these stories. I think we're very good at coming out and making sure people understand the news, but do we ever go back and look? And so one of our papers actually just started what's called a jobs watch. And every time a company announces that they're adding 50 jobs or 100 jobs, they're putting it onto a map of when they announced it and then when they fulfilled it. And, again, it comes back to that accountability piece. And, and I think everybody, not just journalists, need to hold these companies accountable because that's all of our money being spent.
That's it? Great. All right, John, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
So thank you, John and Mark, and thank you to the hardworking team at the Business Journal and to all of our guests from the Press Club for what you do to keep us from becoming immune to the search for truth and fairness to all.
An MCM production.